Well, let's do cursing.
Okay.
I just want to talk about it, Drake. I don't want to do it.
I was trying to think of how I could open it up with like
Yeah, no, you just have bleep.
a little bit of foreshadowing without actually doing it.
Well, hello, you scruffy looking nerf herders.
Oh, that would have been. Oh, that's good actually.
No, I cannot do Han Solo very well at all.
He just stares, brooding.
So, hey, kid.
The only thing I remember is when she's like, "I love you," and he goes,
Yeah.
"Thank you," or "I know."
He's like,
Does he
Are,
say,
are
"I know"?
you, are you serious? Did you just
What
mess up the
just
most
happened?
iconic line in the world?
Now I want to cuss for
Thank
real.
you. Yeah, like, I'm gonna have to change on my mugs. It was thank you.
All right, I know what I'm
Allison
doing.
made a
Potatoes
sock
for
monkey.
Christmas.
Okay,
Allison
I
made
am
a sock monkey
literally.
with a picture of Leia and a picture of Han, and it says "I love you," and then it says the actual thing.
Okay, I know. You know,
There you go.
I'm on the wrong podcast. This is not Star Wars. Is not my thing. It's just not.
All right, so we're opening up the cantina for the scruffy looking nerf herders tonight. The seedy type, the type that are going to come in and maybe they're the anti-heroes. They think they're good, but they have kind of a foul mouth, right? And that kind of gives them their charm. That's
They're
who
the
we're
bad
that's
boys.
the bad boy. That's who we're
Scoundrels.
that's who we're allowing in the cantina tonight. But we're not part of that group. We're going to be the ones talking to those people that show up to the bar. And what we're talking about, speaking of the bar and my drink, it's got my B2 Bomber cup. Thank you very much.
Nice.
What we've been talking tonight is cursing. What is how should a Christian interact or think about cursing? Both did the apostles curse? Did Paul use curse words? The equivalent of curse words in the first century, like words like scubalon and
To clarify, we're talking about profanity. Not cursing and blessing.
Oh yeah, sure. I guess that would be a good idea to differentiate. So yeah, profanity, words that have meanings of ill will towards others. And is there a place for that in your Christian walk? And is that something that we can do? And then if we can, when do we do it? Should we do it in the assembly, or should we do it outside in the world? Should we do it privately? All that stuff. And I'm Drake. I'm a pastor at Trinity Reformed Church. Live in Las Vegas. 3 kids, and have many leather-bound books in my mind.
And I am April Cato, and I am a wife and mother, and I have many more leather-bound books than Drake.
She means like in her bookshelf, though.
Yeah.
And I'm Brian Hodge, and I have the most leather-bound books of all.
So actually, Brian is the only authored one among us, so he can tout that.
No, I have things published too, just not books.
April's been published.
I have been published.
If I give it to my kids, I can say I'm published too.
I have a short story that was published in a book, in an anthology, which you can buy online.
Where?
What's the name of that book?
Why is that not linked?
Well, I can link it. It's linked on the blog.
Producer.
What's the name of the book?
The book is called Whispers from the Universe.
Sounds very new agey.
Yeah, is there curse words in it?
Well, I was gonna say not in April's, but I actually don't know if it was
I don't know. I don't remember.
Oh, see, here we go. Wait, how old is this book?
4 years, maybe.
Oh, okay.
4 or 5 years.
So you're here
Oh.
then.
Yeah, it was published when I was when I started coming to church. So
yeah.
All right. Well, let's talk about it. Let's take a tally first. I'll start with myself. Do I think cursing, profanity, belongs in the Christian life? I would say I would have a nuanced answer and say no, generally, but I think things that the world defines as profanity is not necessarily what the Bible says is profanity, like sarcasm and making fun of stuff. So that would be my answer. April?
I would say that on the whole, I think that profanity and vulgarity doesn't have any place in the Christian life or in the Christian walk, and that there may be contextual exceptions.
I like that one. Yeah, I would say, I would actually say, if we're going to make a blanket statement, I absolutely think that no profanity is ever allowed at any time, anywhere. However, there are things that can become profanity in some contexts that are not profanity in other contexts. And so kind of basically a little bit of April's answer and maybe a little bit of Drake's answer there too.
Wow. So, and disclosure, we did not like talk about this before. So this is like straight up vanilla answering.
First impressions.
First impressions. So let's talk about that then. So if we are going to, if all of us agree that vulgarity, profanity, well, let's define what that is. What is profanity and what is vulgarity as defined in Scripture? Like when the apostles say, when Paul says, like, no profane thing should come out of your mouth, right? What is that? What is that?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, I'd have to ask people if they're thinking that Paul is even talking about specific words, or if he's talking about things that belong in certain contexts being put in the public sphere. So, which I would say, probably both. I think it's. But I think that both have that understanding, because you're going to have people come along and say, you know what, cursing's really just cultural, and because it's cultural, there's no really objective standard for what cursing is, and therefore you might think one thing is cursing and I might think it's not, and we can just there's nothing that we can really agree on, and therefore no one should condemn anybody else for using particular words or talking about particular ideas. And I would say, no, I don't think that's true. I actually think that what is considered a curse word in general is a universal among all cultures. The specific words that you use might be different or will be different according to the language and the culture. That's true. So they're manifested differently by using specific words in your culture, but the concept or what they are, the groupings of words, what they are and what they describe are the same across the board. And I mean, we can maybe talk about what some of those are, but
sure. So I think it's a good definition. Like when we talk about like linguistics, there's a few like theories out there as far as like what is language, right? Are people confined by their syntax and grammar, right? So is the mind confined by the words they use, right? Or is the world, or is whatever is in someone's mind, that's, everyone has that kind of idea. Everyone sees the world. So then grammar and words form to get those ideas out of somebody's mind, right? They're not bound by grammar. Grammar actually defines what they see, which is free flowing thought, right?
Yeah.
So like in one sense, profanity and vulgarity is going to differ culturally. Like not every culture is going to see the middle finger as profanity, right?
Right.
But the spirit behind whatever their version of that is exists in all cultures, right?
What it refers to is the same.
Yeah.
Is the same. And obviously those things come from a fallen world, right? Those those thoughts, those feelings towards another person or towards another thing come from what a heart of a depraved heart, right? I mean, there's, which we all have in common. So all are depraved. All are going to have those desires and thoughts, and they're going to have to communicate those somehow. And if we're, as Christians, not of that man, if we're not living like that anymore, if that's not a part of us, we have another nature now that is good, that can actually look at things in the context of God's sovereignty and what He's doing and His purpose in the world and His purpose in us now. We can live in a way we don't have to use those. We don't have to use profanity to really define any part of us, any part of the world. We seek to undo that, right? I mean, isn't that what we're trying to do? That was
Yeah,
convoluted.
No, it was good. I understood it. I mean, we could talk about, we almost all know what these words are because they come out of your mouth when you're mad. If you don't have control of yourself. And our culture, like, what is produced by the lowest element in our culture? How do they speak? How do junior high kids speak when they're away from the house and they're without parental responsibility or accountability or any of that? There are words that are spoken that are frankly, we would say, out of place. And so I would argue that these words typically are what? They're words that are used, that they're the more explicit words that are used for things that either have to do with going to the bathroom, or they're things that have to explicit words that have to do with sexuality or nakedness or something of that nature. Those typically make up curse words universally. And there are clinical names that
or
are
they're
not
or they're blasphemous.
Right. Well, yeah. Then we would include also blasphemy against God. Things like that where you're using God's name in vain. Although that really is specific to the Bible. I don't know if that's necessarily a universal thing. But the actual other curse words seem to be pretty much universal. Now we might add in our culture, because we're so much on race, we might add a couple like racist words or something that offend people. And those actually might be, if you're going to get anything cultural, that might be more cultural than anything, because ultimately that may not be a universal idea to where you have, obviously there are always derogatory names toward other people and other cultures, but I don't know if they'd be considered like curse words necessarily. But they tend to have to do with the crudeness of bringing an explicit word that describes something in a particular context that might actually be fine in that context, but taking it out to be common or public speech is considered basically that would be considered a curse word. You're using it out of the context, out of the privacy of the context, and you're making it public or common. And that's what I think the Bible is saying. That's not to happen. No unwholesome word is to proceed out of your mouth. And the idea is within that context, now it actually becomes unwholesome because it in fact is no longer functioning in a private way, because it's describing things that are private that really should not be talked about.
I think that's part of the problem, is that our culture does not think that words are important.
Yeah.
We think that they're throwaways. We are we have many, many words, and we need to have fewer. I think we're constantly, whether it's we're tweeting or we're constantly chattering all day long. And the problem is that these types of words, they do have an impact on how people view things like sexuality. And when you're talking about that specifically, and you start using the F word or whatever crass words that you're using that pertain to sexuality, there's a demeaning of the goodness of it, of the holiness of it in the proper context. You're making it something crude and crass, and you're taking away something of its intended purpose.
Yeah. Well, Paul mentions that, like, what is the pagan talk like? Well, he talks about things that shouldn't even be mentioned, and he's talking about in public. And so it's not even just using words, it's the way you even talk about those things. and we have every culture has this as well. Every culture has a clinical expression that you can use, or euphemism that you can use, so you can avoid the explicit expression that should only be used privately, so that you don't use it publicly and you don't demean what it refers to in the public sphere. And so ultimately, like, even the way we talk about it, like in the public, should be either clinical or euphemistically. rather than explicitly. And I think that's what the unwholesome words are talking about. And so people who are like, well, Paul must be talking about something. I don't think so. I think that's exactly what he's talking about. And I have to say that I think the use of those words in the public sphere is demonic. And I always bring this up. I know it's a personal testimony of mine and it's anecdotal, so people will be like, oh, well, that's just your experience. But I used to curse like a sailor. I would get kicked out of class for cursing. Yeah, I mean, I was friends with my high school biology teacher. I took biology 2 years in a row because I obviously did not pass it because I didn't do any work. And so I had the same teacher 2 years in a row. So we became really good friends, but he would still kick me out of class because my mouth was so bad. I had a friend who was an atheist, one of my best friends, and we were talking about going door to door and getting a job maybe and going door to door trying to sell things. And he looked at me and said, Brian, you could never do that. Your mouth is so bad. Every other word's the F word. Every other word's this or that or whatever. I say that to say that when I became a Christian, I didn't say to myself, oh, I need to stop cursing. I didn't even think about it. I looked back after like maybe a couple of weeks or a month and I was like, that's so weird. I don't curse anymore. And it was a part of my language. I mean, it really was like every other sentence. And suddenly it just stopped on its own. And I chalk that up to receiving the Spirit and being in communion with God. And so I don't think it's just benign. I think it evidences something demonic in the person's life. And when I talk to people on the street and they're demonically influenced and every other word out of their mouth is a curse word, or it's basically the language of the pagan, then I'm like, yeah, no, I think there's something demonic about it. I don't think it's actually neutral.
It's interesting. I'm thinking about the degrading nature of the language, and ultimately it is out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. This is actually the words are expressing something that's actually in you, right? And you think about Adam and Eve. I equivocated it like this: like you think about Adam and Eve walking in the garden, and they were naked and they were unashamed, right? They had every reason not to be ashamed in that sense. There's nothing that needed to be hidden. They were doing everything in their proper way. They were obeying what God had commanded to do. Vice versa, you have profanity on this side of the fall. You have people that are unashamed that should be, right. So now they're walking around naked. Like this is literally the equivalent in their speech. Like if you showed up to class buck naked,
yeah,
right, and everyone's like, what are you doing? Like that
right
should be hidden. And they're like, what do you mean? This is fine. Now, like as a Christian, are you the one that's going to be walking it, right? Like the one who's supposed to have the Spirit that is discerning good and evil. Yeah. Like you're growing in wisdom and discernment, and you're the one walking around buck naked. Even the atheists are going to be like, that's weird.
Yeah. Well, I would say, look, the act that those things describe when you're talking about sexuality belongs between you and your spouse. So the words belong between you and your spouse, and that's it. Now, if you and your spouse decide we're gonna use the clinical words, you can do that if you so choose, and ruin the moment. But if you, but you can do what you want. You can decide what you want. It's up to you. But the point is that there's not going to be any word that's like worse than any word that's worse than the act or something. And we shouldn't view the act as worse anyway. I mean, it's good when you're private with it, right? The issue is when it goes beyond those bounds. If the act belongs between you and your spouse and the words belong, then don't bring them outside that relationship. It doesn't belong there. And it becomes crude then, because now you're talking about something that doesn't belong outside that relationship. Same thing with the bathroom. That there's a private thing. You shouldn't even talk that way to your spouse about those things, because it really just is a private thing. And frankly, you don't need to talk about it at all. So in reality, unless you're talking clinically to a doctor because you need to like describe or something. And so in that regard, those words actually never need to be said unless you talk to yourself all the time.
No, it's like you don't let your kids like come out and sit around. At least I don't let my kids come and like sit around the table, and they're toddlers. So now they think it's hilarious to talk about bathroom stuff because they want to get a reaction. And it's like,
Right.
no, we're not talking about that unless you actually need to go to the bathroom. Like this isn't just like a play thing. It's not a play word to get a reaction out of people. And that's how I feel about a lot of these profane and vulgar words, is that especially when Christians do it, they want to get a reaction. It is the equivalent of my toddler sitting at the table and talking about going to the bathroom. You want a reaction, and then you want to be like, oh, I'm just so edgy. It's like, you're not being edgy, you're being a toddler.
Yeah. Now I realize as soon as we say this, people are going to say, well, some words have evolved and you have different people who they've evolved differently in different places. So I'll give you an example. The C word, which I don't use because I grew up believing it was a curse word, but in some parts of the country isn't, believe it or not. So I was at seminary and I had two seminarian guys. We were in the car. I think we went out to eat or something. And one of the guys used the word, and the other guy looked at him and was like, what did you say? It's like, don't be cursing or whatever. And he looked at me like, you think that's a curse word? And it was this sort of like, because obviously some words have evolved. Like, you know, if you read a King James Bible in church, you're going to have a donkey called a particular thing by it. Right. Now that word has evolved the other way, right? Originally it wasn't a curse word, and now it has evolved to refer to something, a sexual part or whatever. And so in that regard, I would say, well, I think for all of us, it's evolved a particular way, and not to use it. And we can just say donkey. We don't need to say the other or whatever. But you have other things. Like I used a word the other day, which I actually kind of think about. I'm like, I kind of regret it using it. But like the S word that's used, right? Because that's evolved the other way to where the etymology is gone in most parts in people's minds in the country, to where it just means something lame. And so it's not connected to its etymology anymore. However, I was like, yeah, but some people might still connect it to its etymology, and therefore I shouldn't have used it in that regard. So I actually regret doing it. But it's things like that to where it's like, okay, I realize I'm not going to judge Christians over it. It's iffy. Maybe it's so evolved with some people that they're not referring to the thing anymore, and no one's really thinking about that anymore. And it's kind of like, that's fine. I'm going to let that go. But I think we all know that there are words that we, everywhere we go, we know what they mean. We know what they refer to. And it frankly is 100% what Paul would be referring to when he's talking about not letting unwholesome things proceed from your mouth, but rather, what are you supposed to do? Whatever's going to be edifying in the community. That's the point. So not these degrading things in public because they don't belong there. And rather you're speaking things that edify the church. Imagine, if a pastor gets up and every other word's like a curse word, that's not edifying. He's talking about things that don't belong in the pulpit, in the Holy of Holies. They belong in a different place that is holy, but it's not holy in the public sphere.
So this came to a head, or this became a hot topic. I don't know, was it a year or two ago when a particular pastor used the S word, right?
Yeah.
Right. And I don't think it was so this is a whole nother podcast where we think God is when the people assemble, right? A lot of people think, well, if he cursed from a platform that wasn't Sunday, then he wasn't in the Holy of Holies, and it's fine.
I think the Bible says that somewhere.
The Bible says that very clearly somewhere.
First opinions.
But because he did it at a conference, this is what April's saying. This is him to like get the edgy point across. Like, this is how serious is it? It's S word serious, right? But really, you're like, like if profanity is exposing what should be private, you're like, how serious is it? Well, let me show you. I'll defecate in front of you. Serious? Like what? Like
right?
You actually reduce the point, and now people it minimizes and actually perverts what you are doing. So now, the exhortation has ceased at that point.
Well, it brings the bathroom into the Holy of Holies.
Right.
That's literally what it's doing. And in the same way that if you were to use a sexual term, it brings your sexual act into the Holy of Holies. It doesn't belong there. you are doing something demonic by doing that.
And I guarantee you,
I mean,
no
people
one's
are going
thought
to
of
bring
that.
up. They're going to bring up Elijah, and they're going to say, "Well, he brought the bathroom in."
Oh, is Baal going to the bathroom?
Well, yeah, but why though? Because the worship. I mean, literally, the temples of Baal are turned into bathrooms.
Yeah.
In the Deuteronomic history, and so the whole point is that it's okay to treat Baal and Baal's temples as bathrooms because that's what they are ultimately. That's the idea. But you wouldn't treat God's temple that way. I don't think Elijah would be talking that way in God's temple. And the important thing is what's the temple for us? It's not some building on Sunday morning. We're the temple when we gather together. So it's the public assembly anywhere we are, no matter where we are. It's even two Christians together. That's, if it's, you're not talking about spouses or something, just two Christians assembling and talking about Christ. That's not the way they should be talking to one another.
I think part of like my biggest concern with this is that it's another way that people bring division into the church, because then you have, well, I'm not like those holier than thou Christians,
right,
who won't use these
I got
words.
my leather jacket on and my motorcycle,
I'm edgy, and I'm,
Right.
I'm more down with the modern guy. And I've heard people make arguments like, well, this is how I become all things to all people, that, they won't listen to me share the gospel with them unless I, drop a couple of
sounds very seeker sensitive.
But that's the problem, is then it becomes just another way to bring division into the church. And that seems the through line lately in all the discussions that we have is, here's another way to divide the church. Here's another way. Here's another way. Well, this is just another way to divide the church.
Well, I think it also breaks down, it gives people the impression that the Bible, again, which is what I hate, that the Bible's unclear. The Bible is unclear, so do what you want. And this is just another issue where the Bible's not clear about. Apparently, God failed to communicate clearly. And it's like, I'm sorry, he didn't fail to communicate. It's understood very well. You're just trying to get out from under it.
Yeah, it's your flesh wanting to do what it wants.
Yeah.
And you're going to make Paul say what you want.
And if you have a rebellious attitude, you can have 50 different reasons why it doesn't say what it says.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean...
Or you're going to say, well, John the Baptist calls Pharisees a brood of vipers.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure brood of vipers is not a curse word in any language. Whitewash sepulchres with rotting corpses, not a curse word.
That was their equivalent. It was the same thing. That's what they'll argue.
Well, so this is where it's helpful to actually know languages, because actually it's not their equivalent. They've got lots of curse words in Greek that could have been used and expressed. There are lots of curse words in Aramaic that could have been used and expressed. That's not any of them. Jesus is actually describing in parabolic form what these people are in terms of their teaching. That's not a curse word.
This just came to my mind. So if I start floundering in my thoughts here, apologize. But I'm thinking of like Pompeii. You talk about like the way the first century curses, right? One of the main ways the first century curses is with pictures, right?
Right.
So like you go to Pompeii, and there's profanity everywhere. I honestly think Pompeii was destroyed because of its hyper, right? It's
licentiousness and
yeah. If that's true, like if Pompeii is bringing out what should be private public, literally in pictures and words, but picture, right? Pictures are just another form of communication, right? Now, as a Christian, if you're doing what Pompeii is doing, like with your words, like think about that. Like God's wiping cities out potentially because of what they're doing. It's a version of Sodom and Gomorrah, and then we think that's okay. Yeah, and it's clear, brood of vipers, whitewashed tombs. That's not how they're cursing in the culture. That's just not what they're doing. And no,
well, also to go back,
would agree with that.
like to go back to what Brian was saying, brood of vipers, whitewashed tomb has nothing to do with sexuality or going to the bathroom or blasphemy or any of the ways that we actually use curse words today.
Yeah. I think, look, at the end of the day, it's what would be said in public is gross. And you kind of identify that way. Like there's that scene in Braveheart where they're about to fight. Did we lose Drake?
My video's down.
Oh, okay. All right. There's you can put like Johnny Cash up instead of Drake.
Not that picture though.
Not that one. But you have that scene in Braveheart where they're about to fight the English, right? And they all like flip their skirts up and their kilts. And it's like everyone's like, that's gross. Like everyone, I think, was like repulsed by it. That you know what doesn't belong. Like you're just kind of you understand that it's gross. It's gross to talk about. Now, after many, many years of being desensitized, I think our culture no longer has that ick from it. But initially you do, because you do know what's gross, and it tends to be, children tend to have that ick and they can feel it, or people who have children can really feel the ick, little children, when they're watching movies, probably more Christians than anyone, but when you're watching movies and there's like curse words, suddenly you become much more sensitized to it and you don't realize how desensitized you've become. But ultimately that tells us something, that these things don't belong out in front of my kids. They don't belong out in the public sphere.
Yeah. And to go back to the spirit, I mean, I used to have a horrible cursing problem, and it was all anger. It was all underneath. It was a spirit of anger, a spirit of rebellion. And I see that with people who continue to persist in this. It's like, Emmanuel works with mostly men, and they're mostly mechanics. So they have some pretty foul language. And it's mostly like these men are very angry and not self-controlled at all. And that's where it's coming from.
Or again, it's a desensitization of sexuality, right? You'll have men who describe sexual encounters, and everybody becomes really uncomfortable about it because they realize down deep, this doesn't belong here. I shouldn't be hearing this right now. This is not good.
Yeah. So we can rule out. So I think with encompassing the brood of vipers, the whitewashed tombs, we can also incorporate like sarcasm. Christ is sarcastic with the Pharisees. Sarcasm is not something that is private, that should be left somewhere, right?
It's a tool of rhetoric.
It's a tool of rhetoric. It's to make points. It's to show the fallacy of arguments. It's got a righteous purpose.
God uses it. Christ uses it all the time. The prophets use it. Everybody uses it in Scripture. Right. It's not an issue,
right? I think in that light, and I guarantee you, most people have not thought of profanity in how we've just defined it, as something that is private, right? Something that is supposed to be done within the context of marriage and the sexual sense, and then of course like privately, defecating, in private. So like there are avenues that I don't think the Western mind has been able to think about this.
Well, I do think, we brought up last time, and since we have a whole podcast, I might as well bring it up this time, is the issue of scubalon, right? So here's the one place that people think Paul cursed. They think it's like somehow the equivalent of the SH word. And I mentioned before that one of the problems with this is that people actually don't know what the curse words are in these other languages. Scubalon is not a curse word.
Right.
And in fact, it doesn't even describe what you think it's describing. It's describing, as I've said before, it's describing things that were not even used in the body and then put out of the body. And so Paul's using it as an analogy for all the pharisaical works that he did, that basically it was completely and utterly useless. That's so here you go. You have one term, let's say you disagree with me and you think it's a curse word, but at very least then now we have a dispute and you have an ambiguous term and you've only got one place out of the tens of thousands of words scripture uses. That should give you a precedent to frankly, like, just don't use words, because if it's only used one time and let's say it is a curse word, then maybe in that one time it was just the perfect things, the stars were aligned, it was perfectly holy and good and everything, but you have no idea when you're going to come across that moment. It's better to actually not do it and not sin.
Unless you're going to say you're inspired. Because that's what it would take, right? If that's the one time.
Well, Ezekiel, he went around naked, so let's all run around naked.
Yeah. Well,
you don't see a pattern of this.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's the argument that one incident we're talking about was used, right? Well, it was that perfect moment that, instead of an alley-oop, it was a dunk. Like, well, okay. But obviously it wasn't, because now we're talking, it's still a point of like contention in this guy's ministry, right? Like, what did he talk about? I don't remember, but I know they used the word. So.
Well, who do you know talks this way the most? It's going to be junior high kids, and it's going to be, people who are drunk or they're on the street or whatever. So what did you just convey about yourself to other people as well? I actually think it also conveys that you're low class and that you're immature and don't have control of your mouth.
Those are things that conveys. It's not something that pagans associate with Christianity.
So now it's a bad witness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Real quick, just on a parallel street here, talking about using things like holy something, attaching sacred words to common things.
Yeah.
Or something that would how should we is Paul talking about that as well? How should Christians look at it?
In our house,
that's innocent typically.
I don't have a a solid, this is just the way that I feel about it. In our house, like, we don't say, and we don't let our kids say, like, oh my goodness, or oh gracious, or any kind of good attribute of God cannot be used as an interjection.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously goodness and gosh and all those are just euphemistic for God, right? So you're referring, again, if we're not getting caught up on the actual manifestation of what words they are, but what they're referring to, and in the way that they refer to those things, then we can understand that gosh can be as bad as saying God in a way that is not like in a holy manner or whatever. So I would just avoid all of that. And if you want to say, I usually replace it with, I'm like, what in the world? Like, I'll say something like that or whatever.
I say, oh man, because he's the problem.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Holy guacamole, Matt.
No, because you can't say holy.
But then you're saying holy with guacamole, and that's the problem.
I've heard a lot of people say holy cow, and I'm like, yeah, no, let's not. There was a cow problem in the Bible. Let's not go.
There was a cow problem.
They're like, I'm blaspheming the cow,
sorry,
April.
Have you guys seen Batman Forever?
Yeah.
A long time ago.
Obviously.
There's a scene where at the end where they're on the Riddler's base, right? Mm. And Robin gets off the bat boat onto the foundation of the base, whatever. And he goes, "Holy rusted metal, Batman!" Right? And Batman's like, "What?" And he's looking at it, and it's like rusted metal with holes in it. And I always remember that. It was a playback to the '60s, but it was also it was clever. Anyway.
Yeah, that was the worst Batman movie of all. But
you like Val Kilmer as Batman? I love Val Kilmer as Batman.
I liked him as Batman, but the rest of the show was horrible.
Okay, well, I mean,
George Clooney was worse. George Clooney was way worse.
George Clooney is just terrible in everything.
Yeah. Well, Ocean's 11 was all right.
Well, that's because it was all right because of the supporting cast.
Yeah. The cat. Yeah, right. The cast carried him.
Well, good. I think that's helpful, and I think for majority of the people we're talking to, they're probably like, yeah, we agree with the profanity. I think this last bit here, like with just the little things that we're talking about, I would say the clumsy speech in that sense with the is something that we can look at and hopefully influence our children, because the cycle's got to be broken somewhere, and we grew up in it, and it's kind of benign for us. But now here's a chance where we can break the cycle with our kids and teach them to speak properly, because there's proper ways to speak in every context.
It's also just a part of having good manners, you know, not speaking in ways that are not encouraging to the body.
Manners,
yeah, and I even see this like in our fellowships. Like I've had people say this in your home, April, in the Cato's home, in my home, in the Hodge home, when we do these fellowships. But there's a sense of like people come over and they feel at home because everything is in its proper place, not like materially. My living room's not set up beautifully, so everyone just feels welcome. And my room is built for, no, it's because actually like what we're saying is edifying. What we're doing to one another is letting guards down, that you can actually speak, and it's everything just feels correct in where it is. There's nothing that is exposed that shouldn't be, that makes it uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
And
especially for new believers, I think it's really important that those who are more mature in the faith learn to speak and communicate in ways that are hospitable, so that then the new believer can come in and not get distracted by all of this garbage speak, but can actually be edified in the truth.
I think that's a really great point, because even in our church, like we have a new believer who's come out of that world, right? And he's come into this, and now it's like it's fresh water, right? It's like refreshing and encouraging and again edifying to hear proper language. You can imagine, like, he comes out of the world as a new Christian, and he comes in, and then we're doing that. Like, what?
Yeah.
He's going to be confused.
Mm-hmm.
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's going to be a distraction. So instead of being able to learn and grow in your faith, now you're basically tripping over words all day. You're stumbling constantly.
Yeah.
I'll say one accolade. Sorry, Brian, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'll say one last accolade on this, and I think unless we want to wrap it up some other way. So I just moved to a new area. We haven't moved in a while, but I used to move all the time. Tried this church out, right? Church was great. And then there was a fellowship meal afterwards. They invited me. I invited the family. We're like, yeah, sure. So we're driving, and one of the guys I met at the service was in front of me, driving to the guy's house where the fellowship was, and he was like taking a left turn. I saw that the light was turning red, so I decided to go straight and then flip a U-ey and then take a right instead of waiting for the left turn arrow. So I did that, and I got in front of him. I didn't know this at the time, but this guy's kind of competitive. This is like my first time meeting him. So we get to this guy's house, right? And he like makes a comment that I beat him, but he used the S word for describing that his disappointment in being beaten, I guess.
Yeah.
And I've even told him this, because I still know we're still friends. And I remember thinking, like, that was my first impression of him, and I was like, what is that?
Yeah.
And I was like, my guard up was with this guy for a while until I knew who he was, and I was like, okay. And I think he's since changed his position on that. But it affects what people like, how people view you in Christ. Like, well, there's something off here. I'll never forget that. But
yeah. So most of my schooling was with Christian professors, right? So obviously they're not cursing and whatnot. And I don't know if you guys know this or not, but I actually was a graduate student at UPenn. I never bring it up, and I never put it in my bio because I dropped out because I hated it so bad.
Oh, wow.
But one of the reasons why I hated it is the professors would curse, and it absolutely just made me lose all respect for them. It had no place in the classroom. And these are small, because when you're in graduate school, these are like, classes of like 5, 6, 7 people or whatever. And I was just like, can you not even control your mouth? Like, how can I even trust that you have a disciplined study of anything?
Like
if you
you're
can't
not a
control your mouth?
professional.
Right. It's very unprofessional. And I realized for the first time, it's like, oh man, I'm not in Kansas anymore. It's literally like these people they're foul mouthed. And it's one of the first times I realized I don't really want this type of education. I want not only the knowledge, I want the character of men who actually have given themselves to God. So I ended up just dropping out because it was just dark. It was such a darker feeling going to UPenn, and I was going to Westminster at the same time. I was doing both. I was like, man, just what a night and day experience of, and I feel like that we don't need that in the church. We don't need people coming in and feeling the same darkness that they have outside. We need to actually teach them, hey, you know what? I have control of my mouth because the fruit of the Spirit is self-control. So I don't just let any word just come out of my mouth. I control it. And if I do let a word slip out because I get angry or emotional or whatever, I've sinned. It's actual sin that I need to repent of. So that's not normative in the community.
April, any final words?
That's it.
Well, we hope this was edifying. It was a good conversation for us. And I always love it that even while we're, Brian and I are obviously pastors, we're still learning. Even as we talk to each other in this, it's good to sharpen iron with one another. So good talking with you. Thanks for watching. If you want to support us, join us on Patreon. There's the link. You can be a starfighter. I think you start out in shooting womp rats, and then eventually you can graduate into a real starfighter. Maybe
Blow
find
up the Death Star.
Love the Death Star. We got good stuff on Patreon. You get videos earlier. We also have more of the after show. I guess what the cantina is closed to the public, but the members can stay for a little while. So we got some videos there. We were watching Rings of Power, eating donuts, having a good time. Not so much theology. So
just a lot of donuts.
A lot of donuts and laugh a little bit. Come and join us. So we'll see you next time. Peace.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Haven't read the series, might not understand what would need to happen.
Have you read all of them?
I've read all of Frank Herbert's novels. Yes.
Oh, you've read all of them. I've only read the first one because my grandma told me that the other ones were bad.
Let me just start with this. Frank Herbert is not a good storyteller. Not a good storyteller. He's a fantastic world builder.
Harry and I, we're pals. Harry and I were
Harry and the Hendersons.
You grew up at Hogwarts?
The first book came out. Harry and I were around the same age, and so I grew up with books. Like the last book came out when I was 19, and Harry was around 19. This, I went to a Christian high school, so this was a big deal. It was a big thing. Harry Potter is evil, and you can't be reading this or participating in this.
The reason why I like Moby Dick so much is, to me, there's a parallel with Genesis. So it's actually history. It's history that Melville he's interviewed. This actually occurred to a bunch of whalers.
Yeah.
And the survivors he interviewed.
Yeah.
And it became this book. But notice how he's writing this history. It's not, here's all the facts that happened. All right, the end. He's writing it because he wants to put meaning and a message to what has occurred.